Are we live, Naresh, now? Dr. Tiwari, you will start.
I will start. Very good morning and good evening for the colleagues from US. Namaskar. I once again had privilege to welcome all of you on the 5th Diamond Jubilee lecture of CSIR NGRI with our very distinguished speaker today, Professor Jean-Philippe Auvac, with whom I had the privilege of meeting 2 decades back when I was postdoctoral fellow at IPGP, Paris, where he completed his PhD with one of the another very distinguished geologist, Professor Paul Cottenier. We all know that the physics and the mechanics of lithospheric properties are so important in understanding of the processes which are driving most of the phenomena which we observe over the surface of the earth. And one amongst them is right from the long-term deformation leading to the mountain building, and the consequences at the short terms are the earthquakes. And these two end members of the lithospheric deformations are very well studied by Jean-Philippe and his group at Caltech and several of his collaborators you might see from the different parts of the world, where they also have been specifically addressing the issues related at the lithospheric plate boundaries. I would also like to, at the very beginning, thank Professor Jean-Philippe Auvac not only for agreeing to speak and deliver the Diamond Jubilee lecture in a very short notice, but also kindly consented to speak at very late evening from his local time. So it's our really pleasure of hosting Jean-Philippe, though virtually it would have been really a great privilege had we been having Jean-Philippe Auvac at CSIR NGRI. Nevertheless, we hope that we will certainly, after this global pandemic, have possibility of hosting the distinguished speakers of today. I am also very pleased to see that several of our senior luminaries of the geosciences, Professor Harsh Gupta, Dr. R.M. Singh, Professor Singhvi, our distinguished member of the Research Council, and several young students have joined through the online platform. So I once again take this opportunity to welcome all of you and look forward listening Professor Jean-Philippe Auvac. And now I request Dr. Vineet Gehlot to formally introduce today's speaker. Vineet,
thank you, Dr. Viren Tiwari. I'll try to be brief, although, please excuse me if I miss a lot of things, in fact. because his biodata is his contribution to tectonics of Himalaya earthquake occurrence process is tremendous. So, but even then, I've tried to pick up a few points just to introduce you. Although he doesn't need an introduction when it comes to Himalayan tectonics. So Jean-Philippe, he did his PhD in 1991 from IPGP. Until 2002, he was in France at least two places. Please excuse me if I don't pronounce the French correctly. So he was at Laboratoire de Géophysique and Chef du Laboratoire de Télétraction at Risk Seismique. Then in 2003, he shifted to Caltech and he became professor there. He was director from 2003 to 2014 of the prestigious Caltech Tectonics Observatory. Then right now, since 2018, he is the director of NSF-funded Center for Geomechanics and the Mitigation of Geohazards. I still remember when I was doing my PhD, I still remember in 1993, one of his paper which appeared in GRL, and there was a cover image from his paper. So in the paper, he was talking about the deformation and tectonics of Himalaya and Tibet region, kinematic deformation of the region, extrusion of Tibetan Plateau, and that was a tremendous work. And there's no doubt that this paper probably has got more than 1,000 citations. So that's where from I started following Jean-Philippe. He's one of the finest reviewer. I mean, apart from a finest researcher, he's one of the finest reviewer, and he has been recognized by almost all leading journals, for example, GRL, GGR, EPSL. He has also been associated with the editorial board of these journals. So that's about Jean-Philippe. I'll also like to tell you what is this Diamond Jubilee function, Diamond Jubilee year of this institute. So this institute was established sometime in 1961, and to mark this 60 years, we are organizing several lectures by distinguished scientists like you. So every month we have one lecture. This is the 5th lecture in this series. We are trying to introduce some fellowships to have exchange visits. In-house activities involve development of a rock museum, exhibits, and then we are also trying to bring out some special issues in some national and international journals. We are also trying to publish some theme-based books. We are trying to highlight the achievements of this institute, and we are also developing some outreach program. Of course, all these things are strongly influenced by the pandemic which is going on. So there are some few things which are where we are finding it difficult. So that's the reason we decided to go to do online, to emphasize more on online lectures. So with this, I will hand it over to Jean-Philippe and request him to deliver this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinit, for the very kind words. And I wanted to thank Virendra Tiwari for the invitation to give that presentation. It's a great honor for me to be part of this celebration. So I'm going to give you a tour of the research we've been doing over nearly 25 years now, with a number of collaborators who have worked with me over the years, starting with collaborators from Nepal, and then a number of students, postdocs, who've worked with me over the years, either in France, in the USA, or in the UK. I singled out John Galecka because he's been instrumental in the deployment of the geodetic network that we have deployed in Nepal, and is now the director actually of the US Geodetic survey. So he left my group something like 10 years ago to work for UNAVCO and now moved to this new position. So my journey in the Himalaya started when fresh out of my PhD, I joined a geophysical lab at the French Atomic Agency, in fact, who had started a collaboration with Nepal to deploy some seismic stations. So at the time, that was in 91, they were operating 5 stations around Kathmandu Basin, and they just got an agreement to deploy a network covering all of Nepal. So I arrived just at the right time so that I could be engaged in that collaboration. And what happened over the years is that we have augmented the seismic network with geodetic stations. So we started deploying a few when I was in France, and then many more when I was in the US, so that today in Nepal there's something like 27 permanent GPS stations. And this was complemented with campaign GPS. And of course, we could take advantage also of the measurements done by collaborators or colleagues working in Tibet or India. So the reason I was interested in working in the Himalaya is that there is no better place to understand how mountain building is working, and also because it's a particular place for seismic hazard. And as you all know, the Himalaya is famous not only for its unmatched elevation, but also for its historical seismicity. And one question that we may have in mind when we look at the Himalaya, but that also applies to any plate boundary we would look at around the world, is what shall we expect in the future, and what can we tell based on the past seismicities? For example, when you look at this map, it looks like ruptures of historical events tend to line up along the Himalayan front, but what should we expect in those places that haven't ruptured over the last 2 centuries? Is it the place where an earthquake will happen in the future, or actually are these places devoid of earthquakes because, let's say, deformation would be a seismic, or maybe they would break in smaller earthquakes? So the hope is that with monitoring the Himalaya of Nepal, we might help shed some light into these questions and actually be able to use seismic monitoring and GPS monitoring to inform probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, in addition to advancing the understanding of how mountain building works. So let me start with teasing you with a few observations. I'm sure that many of you are well familiar with those things, but maybe not all of you. So let me start with what was observed from the seismic monitoring, and similar observations were made elsewhere. I'm focusing on Nepal because this is where I work, but most of these observations would apply elsewhere. The first striking result is that the seismicity is very clustered, and it tends to follow the front of the high Himalaya. So here you have a map of about 5 years of seismicity, located precisely by Saudi Rajare using a double difference technique, and you see that it's very, very clustered. So that's an intriguing observation, because if you compare the seismicity with where the most active fault at the front Himalaya lies, so if you connect all the segments that form the main frontal thrust, you realize that the seismicity is something like 100 kilometers offset from the fault trace of the most active fault. And then you wonder, why do we have this large offset? Why is it that we don't have any seismicity between the active fault trace and on the front of the high Himalaya? This observation also leads to other intriguing question is, you might think that the seismicity is building the high Himalaya because this is where you have the high topography, and this correlation with the seismicity might be telling that. But then you look at what happened during the Gorkha earthquake. And here you have INSAR measurements showing the line of sight displacement, so mostly the vertical displacement due to the earthquake. So blue is down, red is up. And what you see is that the area corresponding to the high Himalaya, just north of the Kathmandu basin, actually went down. So the high Himalaya went down during the Gorkha earthquake. So it's sort of intriguing because you would have expected that maybe those earthquakes, and the Gorkha earthquake is sort of part of this cluster of seismicity, you may have thought that those earthquakes would build the topography. Actually, what you realize is that the Himalaya went down. The Kathmandu basin went up. It's red. So that's intriguing. Another intriguing observation, now related to the Gorkha earthquake in particular, is that you see that Kathmandu lies more or less in the area of the rupture, the area that went up because it's a shallow dipping thrust, relatively closely corresponds to the rupture area of the fault at depth. So Kathmandu was above the rupture area, and magnitude 7.8. So we would have expected actually a lot of destruction in a city like Kathmandu, where a lot of the buildings are quite vulnerable. If you've been to Kathmandu, you may have noticed that a lot of buildings are not particularly well prepared to resist seismic hazard. And the truth is that most of these buildings are still standing after a 7.8 earthquake that occurred just something like 10 kilometers beneath the basin. And you might wonder why, because this is not what we would have expected from standard grand motion prediction equation, for example, established for California. So this is quite intriguing. Why is it that shaking? So that's an indication that shaking was relatively mild in Kathmandu during the earthquake, and we would like to understand why. Shaking was mild, but on the other hand, buildings that were relatively well built were destroyed. And these were mostly tall buildings. So, of course, there is the iconic example of the Bimsam Tower, the Dara Tower, which actually collapsed totally during the earthquake. But when you look at the buildings that were damaged or collapsed during the earthquake, they are all tall buildings. And so, and some of them relatively modern. So you might wonder why we have this dichotomy of the resisting quite well on the modern taller one, suffering relatively heavy damages. So another intriguing observation to tease you more is the temporal variation of seismicity. So we're looking at the same seismicity here, but now we're looking at how it has varied through time over 6 years or 7 years. And you see clearly here a seasonal pattern. We will see that this is not an artifact, it's a real signal. And then you might wonder, why would we have a seasonal signal in the Himalaya? The clue came from GPS mostly. And when we looked at the GPS time series, we noticed that we also have a seasonal variation of contraction across the Himalaya. So let me tell you what we have here. So this red station is a station that is north of the Himalaya. It's actually Lhasa. The blue station is a station that is south of the Himalaya in the Terai. And what you see is that the station, the reference here is taken to be India. So India is fixed. So the stations north of the Himalaya are moving south. So we do have contraction across the range. And then you see that on top of the secular contraction of the order of 2 centimeters per year across the range, you have this seasonal variation, and which suggests that there is a faster rate of contraction in the winter than in the summer. That's also an intriguing observation that it took us a bit of work to figure out. So I hope that by the end of the talk, I will have convinced you that we have come up with reasonable explanations for these intriguing observations, and that it has helped us address the more fundamental question of how the Himalaya is growing today, on how we can make use of the geodetic data and seismicity data to inform probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. So the roadmap for the rest of the talk. So I'm going to talk first about what we've learned from geodesy and also geological study, mostly geomorphological studies. I will give a little more information on the Gorkha earthquake, and then I will discuss the seasonal variations. So we've learned quite a bit from GPS stations. So this is an example of one of the permanent GPS stations that we have deployed in Nepal. When I say we, it's mostly John who's been doing that work with our colleagues from Nepal. And now, if you combine the data from Nepal with all the data from the region to start from the broader picture, the first thing that you see is that if you calculate the horizontal strain rate map by looking at the gradient of horizontal horizontal velocities measured from the stations, you see that, and this is not a surprise, really the Himalaya is standing out, the place where the strain rate is the highest. So there's a clear concentration of high strain rate along the Himalayan front. And you see that there's not a lot of lateral variations. It's relatively uniform along the arc. Maybe that gap could be real. I'm not sure if it's not an artifact, but otherwise it's relatively uniform. So now that you've seen that there's a lot of contractions of the order of 2 centimeters per year across the Himalaya, you might wonder what fraction of this deformation is actually elastic strain building up to be released in future earthquakes. So you would like to be able to actually determine how much of this deformation can be considered elastic. And that's in principle a very difficult problem. And we will see that in the case of the Himalaya, we can put a hand on that question. Then the question will be, how can we make use of these measurements, the constraint we can put on the fraction of deformation that is actually elastic, to say something about the frequency of large damaging earthquake, the return period of large damaging earthquake. And then what can we learn from that about how the mountain is built? Okay, so let's move a little bit to geology. So we're going to look at a section across the Himalaya at the location of the Kathmandu Valley. This is a simplified section, but if you were to take a section anywhere else along the Himalaya, it would look similar. The idea is that the most frontal fault in the system, what traditionally is called the main frontal thrust, connects with all the thrust that you can see in the Himalayan wedge along a soling thrust system that we generally call the main Himalayan thrust. So actually the MFT might be considered that the surface expression of the main Himalayan thrust. So the structure involves a flat ramp flat system with a duplex here, and so there are variations from place to place, but the general picture is about the same everywhere. So we started trying to constrain geological rate of deformation on those major thrusts, starting from the terrain, looking in the foothill, in the Siwaliks. So here's a section of the most frontal system where you have a very simple fault band fault system. So this is the fault forming a ramp and routing at the top of the Indian basement being thrust under the Himalaya. So Jérôme Lavet, during his PhD, has been working with me on mapping deformed terraces which have been uplifted due to the growth of that fault. So here's an example of an abandoned terrace covered with gravel. And you can see that at this place, which is close to the front, the river hasn't been offset by a lot. It's maybe 10 meters or something like that above the present riverbed. So the idea is that you can map the former riverbed here across the anticline to measure how much uplift has occurred since the river was abandoned. So Jerome has been doing that along different rivers. So I'm showing here one example along the Bagmati River. You see that this terrace is particularly continuous. It's quite nice, well folded. It correlates with the fold geometry as detailed from the structural measurements. And so then you use C14 dating. At the time, we were not using OSL. We are using mostly C14. And what we found is that this terrace, for example, was abandoned about 9,000 years ago. And then you have younger terraces below that have been folded less. So you have the history of folding here from these abandoned terraces. Next, one thing that you can do is that if this is a fold bend fold, then it has formed by shear parallel to the bedding. So in such a system, then you can relate the uplift to the horizontal displacement simply from the fact that the vector of displacement is parallel to the fault at depth, and hence is parallel actually to the bedding at the surface, because it's shear only parallel to the bedding. So with this geometry, it is relatively simple to convert the uplift pattern of each terrace into a horizontal shortening across the anticline. And you can do that for all the terraces. So here is a plot where you have here the cumulated shortening across this fold. And so the terrace I was talking about, which was abandoned 9,000 years ago, has recorded about 200 meters of shortening. So here you have the age abandonment of the terraces, and now the next thing you do is that you do a least square feet to this data to determine the horizontal shortening rate. And what you find is that over the last 10,000 years, this fold has been shortening at a rate of about 2 centimeters per year. So this has to be the slip rate on the fold, which is emerging at the front of the fold. Okay, so now we have determined that this fault is active, is slipping at about 2 centimeters per year, and we looked at the other faults, and most of them have negligible slip rate. So in that particular section, all the action is taking place on that main frontal thrust. And what is interesting is that the slip rate on the fault, which must be the slip rate on the detachment, so the convergence across that frontal part of the system, is also equal to the convergence across the entire Himalaya at this longitude. So for these two to be equal, there can't be any anelastic deformation in the geodetic data, because you need to transfer all the geodetic shortening into slip on the fault at the front of the system. So let me explain this maybe a little better with this diagram. So what we've learned from the deformed terraces is that over 10,000 years, you have 2 centimeters per year of shortening at this location. So this is distance along the section. This is horizontal velocities relative to India. So this is the foreland of India. So in the long term, it doesn't move. It's the reference frame. And as soon as you pass the fault, you have a shortening of 2 centimeters per year. This is what we measure from the deformed terraces. From the GPS, at the surface, you measure a smooth gradient of horizontal velocities. So this is what is happening in the interseismic period. So now if you assume that the interseismic period is stationary, that the rate is not changing, you need to catch up during transient deformation events. And so the green arrows are representing the deficit of displacement at the Earth's surface, so that in the long run, you have localized deformation at the MFT. Okay, and so what is depicted here is a system where you have a complete elastic rebound. The deficit of slip due to the fault being locked at the surface at depth, so I will explain that later, is completely compensated by transient motion, so that in the end you transfer all the deformation to the front of the system. So this is an example where we can tell that the geodetic strain is mostly elastic. So Vicky Stevens, who has been working on that problem more recently, has done a compilation of all the rates that were established at different locations along the Himalaya, looking at river terraces mostly. So these are the blue dots here, and this is distance along the Himalayan arc. And this is compared with the shortening rate in red, determined from GPS. And you see that in general, they match. If there were an elastic deformation, if the part of the geodetic strain was an elastic, then you would expect the geodetic convergence to be larger than the geological convergence. And there are only a few places where this happens, and the discrepancy is relatively small. Okay. So next, what you learn from that is that the only way you can have this pattern of geodetic rain is by having the fault being locked from the surface to a certain depth. And actually, if you do some modeling, assuming that the medium is homogeneous elastic, you find that more or less the point of locking corresponds with this kink in the pattern, which would correspond also with the hinge zone, the zone where you have a transition to higher uplift rate. But I'm not showing the vertical displacement here. They're a little bit too noisy. I will show them later. So from the geodetic data, you can actually do an inversion and determine the pattern of locking of the fault. And this is what is mapped here. So where you have 1, it means that the fault is fully locked. And where it's white, it means that the fault is creeping. So what you find here is that to first order, the fault is fully locked from the surface to a depth of about 15-20 kilometers over a width of the order of 100 kilometers. And then based on that, you can calculate how much moment is building up in the interseismic period. So when you do that, you find that the moment amounts to about 10 to the 19 Newton meter per year. Okay, so that's the deficit of moment that needs to be released by transient slip event on the locked portion of the fault in red here. So then you might wonder what fraction of this moment might be released by earthquakes, and what fraction might be released by other transient, like maybe slow slip event. We've never seen any slow slip event convincingly. I mean, I know that some of you have argued with maybe some at places, but they would not release a lot of moment anyway, so it would not change a lot the moment budget argument. So at this point, what we've learned is that the seismicity correlates with the down dip edge of the locked zone, and actually this is exactly what you expect, because when you do the modeling, you find that this is where stress is building up in the interseismic period. So you expect earthquake to nucleate at this location of stress buildup. And they don't reach this small earthquake. So those ones go up to magnitude 6. They don't reach much of the moment. And you see that from that plot here, where you have in green the cumulated moment released by all these earthquakes, starting from the smaller one to the larger one. So in that catalog, the larger one might be 5.8. And in blue, this is the moment deficit inferred from the geodetic data. So what you see is that the earthquake, and this is the log of the moment, by the way, it's a logarithmic scale. So you see that those earthquakes, they have released accumulated moment over the 5 years or 6 years covered by the catalog, that is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the moment deficit due to the fault being locked. So we do need much larger earthquake to release the elastic strain. And this is no surprise, of course. So what we can say at this point is that geodetic deformation, in absence of earthquake larger than 5.8, let's say, is 99% seismic. and we need larger earthquakes to fill the gap. So this is what probably those earthquakes are doing, right? The large historical earthquake, they are the major one releasing the geodetic elastic strain building in the interseismic period. So we do need some of them, however, to reach the surface. And until, I would say, the Kashmir earthquake, there was some debate whether any large Himalayan earthquake had produced significant ruptures at the surface. And the Kashmir earthquake was probably the first, obvious one with very significant ruptures. So here is a map of surface ruptures produced by correlating optical images acquired before and after the earthquake. So what is shown here is the amplitude of horizontal displacement, the north-south component of the displacement, measured from correlating after images, so optical satellite images. And you see a clear discontinuity here. And from that discontinuity, you can determine the north-south component of the slip vector at the fault. You can do the same thing with the east-west component. And when you combine east-west and north-south, you have the horizontal displacement at the horizontal slip vector at the fault. And so what you see is that the earthquake ruptured the surface over a distance of about 85 kilometers and produced up to 7 meters of nearly pure deep slip component. There's a small strike slip, but not large, and an average of 5 meters. So you had an increment of thrusting at the surface here, so creating topography. So some earthquakes are actually reaching all the way to the surface, and these are the big ones. So 7.6 is probably among the smaller ones doing the job. When you combine with seismology, you make also an interesting observation, is that this earthquake started at this location, which is actually below the high topography of the Himalaya. So it started exactly at the same location of this small cluster of seismicity that I was commenting on for the Nepal Himalaya. And then it propagated upward and laterally at a rate of about 2.5 kilometers per second, and by about 30 seconds, it had killed about 85,000 people. So that was quite a disaster, very different from the Gorkha earthquake of 2019. So let's now look at whether earthquakes with magnitude 7.6 or 7.8, like the Gorkha earthquake, are doing the job of filling the gap. So this is the same plot I've shown earlier, but now we have added the moment released by the larger earthquakes that we took from the NEIC catalog. So this includes all the way to the Gorkha earthquake. And you see that when you go all the way to magnitude 7.8, you still have a factor of 10 here, too little moment released by the seismicity to match the moment released in the interseismic period, the moment deficit in the interseismic period. So we do need significantly larger earthquake than 7.8 actually to reconcile the moment deficit in the interseismic period with the moment released by large earthquakes. So this is not a completely new finding. A number of geologists, probably including some of you on the call, have documented evidence for large ruptures along the MFT at different locations along the Himalayan arc. So I'm showing here a picture of one study done in Nepal, in which I was not involved, by some Sapkota, Laurent Bollinger, Paul Taponnier, and others. And this is one of those studies which are demonstrating that it looks like we've had in the past slip events of the order of tens of meters or maybe 15 or things like that. And in that particular trench, the authors have argued that they could find evidence for two historical ruptures the 1215 earthquake, which actually is known to have killed the king of Nepal, on the 1934 beyond Nepal earthquake. And you see that the Siwalik sandstones are thrust over, relatively recent gravels. Excuse me. So now is I'm going to show you an animation here that summarizes the story I've told you. So the idea is that in the interseismic period, the fault is locked from the surface to about 15 kilometer depth. Stress build up here, small earthquakes are nucleating, and then once in a while, you have one of these earthquakes which are able to propagate all the way to the front. And this is maybe what happened in the 1215 earthquake, or in some of these large historical events that we see here. So let's now discuss what we can say about how large and how frequent is possibly the largest earthquake in the Himalaya. So this is actually the same diagram, but presented in a different way, so that we recognize here the Gutenberg-Richter distribution. So here, this is the log of the number of earthquakes with magnitude larger than what is plotted here, the value plotted here. So it's the traditional Gutenberg-Richter plot. And the green triangles is the same catalog as this one. And this one is the same as this one. And so what you can do in this space is that you can calculate what should be the end of a Gutenberg-Richter distribution, so that the moment released by all the earthquake, when you do the integral, would balance the moment deficit building in the interseismic period. So I don't go into the detail of that, but this blue line here is showing the location of the endpoint of all the possible Gutenberg-Richter distribution that would balance the moment budget. And then you search for the most probable distribution that is consistent with the historical distribution. So without going into the details of that, here I'm showing the endpoint of the distribution. And what is shown here is the probability of closing the moment budget, balancing the moment budget with a maximum event not exceeding the value that is plotted here. So if we assume, so there are important assumptions made here, if we assume that interseismic strain is stationary, doesn't change through time, and that all the transient slip events are seismic, and we don't have giant slow slip event, for example, then what we find is that it's not possible to close the moment budget with a maximum event not exceeding 8.7. So we need to get to magnitude above 8.7 to start to balance the moment budget. At 9, we do the job, and we don't need earthquakes larger than 9.2, thankfully, to balance the moment budget. So, but that tells us that the possible maximum earthquake in the Himalaya is probably of the order of 9, with the line of reasoning that we have followed. The return period of such event would be of 1,000 years. So this is 1 over the return period. So 10 to the minus 3 would be 1,000 years. Okay, so let's say a few words now about how we can piece together everything to explain now geological mountain building in the long run. So here I'm showing an example of a dynamic simulation that was done by Luca Dal Zilio. And Rodolphe Catin had done similar things like that in the past, but this is a more advanced numerical technique that was developed by Taras Garia at ETH. So here, what is done is that the thermal structure is imposed. I've shown it very briefly, but this would be the isotherms. So this is a thermal structure derived from thermobarometric studies in the Himalaya. And the crust and the lithosphere is modeled with assuming visco elastoplastic rheology, so thermally activated. And this is the strain that is produced here in the interseismic period according to this model. And the model has a friction law that is able to produce some seismic events. So it's rate and state friction. And so what we see here is that between slip events, the medium is mostly elastic, and you can fit with the model relatively well the horizontal GPS in blue, or even the vertical in pink. I have not shown them yet. And what is interesting is that this model that has a ramp flat, ramp flat geometry produces a bimodal seismicity with most of the earthquakes staying around the ramp. So that would explain the cluster that we see beneath the high Himalaya, and sometimes the earthquake propagating on the flat portion, eventually all the way to the surface. So it looks like the ramp helps producing the bimodal distribution. It's not the only explanation, but it's one explanation. The other one is that there is stress accumulation here, and you need more frequent, you nucleate more frequently the earthquake at the down deep edge of the locked fault zone. When you look at the long-term displacement produced by this model, let's take a station at this point here. This is the history of interseismic uplift. So between slip event, the high range would be moving up at about 7 millimeter per year. And you see that every year, every few hundred years, it goes down, like what happened during the Gorkha earthquake. So indeed, the high Himalaya actually would be formed essentially by a seismic silent uplift. Okay? And it goes down each time there's a large earthquake. And when there's a large earthquakes, actually this area, I'm looking at the green triangle here, goes up a little bit. So the basing would go up a little bit each time there's a large earthquake. Let's now go back to the Gorkha earthquake to say a few details about the Gorkha earthquake. So this is the rupture area of the Gorkha earthquake derived from the inversion of the geodetic and the INSAR measurements. So you can see that it's more or less, it belongs to the family of those black dots. It's just a bigger version of those previous events. It didn't propagate much along the flat portion of the system, not very far, I would say. So we have very good high-rate GPS measurements. So I know that you are making a huge effort of GPS deployment in Nepal, in the Himalaya at the moment. And I don't know what you are, the specification of the system, but I hope that these records will inspire you to go to high frequency, because at these stations we were recording the ground motion at a frequency of 5 samples per second. And what happens is that with such records you can detail. So here 0 is the time at which the earthquake started. It started at about 100 kilometers away from Kathmandu to the west of Kathmandu. So for about 35 seconds, nothing happened. No motion was detected at the GPS station in Kathmandu. And you see that suddenly it moves south by 1.5 or to 2 meters in something like 10 seconds, and then it stabilized. So these two stations, which are on the bedrock near Kathmandu, they show a simple, smooth history of a sudden motion to the south. The east-west component show a swing that suggests a pulse propagation. I will show that later. This station in Kathmandu basin is quite different. You see that in addition to the swing to the south, you have these oscillations. Now you start to see the clue for the destruction of the tall buildings. You have oscillations at a period of about 5 seconds that are very prominent in those records. This is another record of that earthquake, but now from an accelerometric station in Kathmandu. And what you see here is that the peak ground acceleration was no more than about 20% of g. So it was a very mild acceleration, in fact, given the size of the earthquake and the amplitude of displacement that you see at the surface. Everything moved by 2 meters, but actually it happened relatively smoothly over something like 10 seconds. So if you doubt that the records themselves are showing you a relatively smooth ground motion, I'm showing here this video that was put together by David Mensin, who tied a video surveillance record from a square in Kathmandu to the record of the ground motion in Kathmandu. So you see the swing that I was talking about. That's the east-west component. The ground moving initially east and then west, and then it stabilizes. But before it stabilizes, you have these oscillations, and you see the people in the square. I mean, only a few of them were not able to stand, but most of them could stand, and the building didn't collapse. So there was not so much shaking, but there was a lot of back and forth motion, and you can see this is of the order of nearly a meter of amplitude. So for 5 seconds, with a period of 5 seconds on the duration of 1 minute. So this is probably the explanation for the destruction or the damage of the tall buildings. The small buildings, they can move by 1 meter at a period of 5 seconds. They can move with the ground with no problem. The tall building, because of their inertia, they have quite intense shear. Yeah. So let's talk about the high frequency. Why is it that there was not so much high frequency recorded in Kathmandu? Why, when we look at teleseismic records from California or anywhere, you don't see that there is any depletion of the high frequency earthquake? The source was just a normal source. So why is it that, what happened to the high frequencies? So to look at that, we worked with Link Meng, Pablo, and Puero on a technique using based on the back projection of the seismic wave field. So the idea is to pass band to pan pass the records around 1 Hertz. So here Linksen took the stations from Australia, and to back project this 1 Hertz wave field to the source area of the Gorkha earthquake, and to see where the sources are coming from as a function of time. So here the color coding is showing time. So it goes from 0 to 1 minute. And you see a very gradual migration of the source of the high frequencies toward the east. Kathmandu is here. So what is interesting is that the high frequencies are relatively far north of Kathmandu. And the propagation actually of the high frequencies is of the order of 2 to 3 kilometers per second. So it is interesting to plot the location of the high frequencies together with the vertical displacement measure from INSAR. I've shown that figure earlier, but they were not the location of the high frequency, which are the lozenges here. So what you see here is that the high frequencies are following the hinge line. This is going up, this is going down, and on the high frequencies are coming from the place at the hinge. So that's telling us that the high frequencies were generated not in the area of high slip, but actually at the down dip end of the rupture area, because the hinge zone is quite closely following the down end of the rupture. Okay, so another way to show that is to show the result of this inversion. So here you have an inversion of the geodetic time series. So we are using the high rate GPS data. And on top of that, so what is plotted here is the slip rate on the fault, the color coding. So the slip rate goes up to about 1 meter per second. And the color dots are showing the high frequency, the sources of the high frequency. So you see that they come from the northern part of the slipping area. Okay? So we have this is a very nice example actually of a slip pulse propagating along the system, along the fault. Okay, so now what is the explanation for the fact that the sources of high frequencies are offset with respect to the rupture? The color coding is the rupture area, and again you have the location of the high frequencies here. Two possibilities. One would be that it would correspond to the transition from the ramp to the flat system. It would be geometric. It's a reasonable explanation, and that could work. Personally, I prefer another explanation. We've seen that the seismicity actually also falls along that same area, the background seismicity before the Gorkha earthquake, and that it marks also the down deep end of the locked fault zone. So what happened is that in the interseismic period, the fault is locked from the surface all the way to here. You have stress building up here. You have high stresses. So at the time of the earthquake, you have the Gorkha earthquake unzipping a zone with a gradient of stress. High stresses at the down deep end of the locked zone and lower stresses here. And as a result, this is going to generate more energetic waves, and also because you have all this background seismicity, you have a very heterogeneous stress field. All the background seismicity that has occurred before are redistributed the stress, so you have a rupture unzipping a zone of high stresses and heterogeneous stresses, and that's the recipe to get high frequency. So we tested that with Rémi Michel. We did some dynamic modeling, and here's an example. It's a very simple dynamic model. In fact, you have a patch here that is rate weakening so that it can produce rupture, and the area around is rate strengthening, so it's going to creep. And you see that the earthquake nucleates at the edge. It propagates laterally, just like the Gorkha earthquake did. And so, of course, we did some tuning of the parameters to get about the same characteristics. And when we look at the frequency of the radiated waves, we do find that we have higher energy at high frequency close to the edge due to the high stresses in that area. So that seems to work. But the flat geometry could be another explanation. So what does it mean that during another oh yeah, before I move to the next thing, yes. What about the resonance that we've seen at 5 seconds? A simple way to explain it is the effect of the sediments around in the Kathmandu Basin. So here's a simulation done by Chen Ji Wei from NTU in Singapore. You see the wave field generated by the earthquake, and he has put the Kathmandu Basin, only the Kathmandu Basin in the model. And what you see here on top of the topography, what you see is that the basins start to resonate. So a fraction of the seismic waves are trapped in the waves and do the resonance at about the right frequency of 4 to 5 seconds. And it does oscillate for about 1 second. So this oscillation is relatively well understood. We don't see any in the Terai just because it's not in the model. But in reality, there must have been something similar happening in the Terai. Okay. Last point of my talk today, I will be very, very quick on that. Yeah, I realized that there's one slide I wanted to comment on. Oh, yes. Okay. I didn't show that the next event. So event 12 was the event looking like the Kathmandu, the Gorkha earthquake. But what happens after an earthquake like that? You transfer stress to the locked portion. So you start to build more heterogeneous stresses within the interior of the system. And so what happens is that the next rupture will be able to propagate further in. And actually, in that case, we have a large rupture, able to rupture the whole thing. And now, because we have higher stresses transferred to the interior by previous rupture, we can have high-frequency waves generated from the flat portion or the flat or the locked portion of the MHT. So the fact that I would say we should not be prepared to see only mild shaking for earthquake rupturing the flat portion of the MHT. I think that's something important to have in mind. I wish it would be smooth on mild every time, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So coming back to the seasonal variation of seismicity, here is a quick test to show that it's not an artifact. You have the Gutenberg-Richter distribution for seismicity in the winter in red, for the seismicity in the summer in blue. So 2 months in the winter, 2 months in the summer, and you can see that there's an offset at all magnitude range. So clearly there are more earthquakes in the winter than in the summer. And we also have a faster contraction rate in the winter than in the summer, so it correlates with the seismicity. What is the reason for that? So it took us a bit of time to understand. So we had, of course, the idea that it would be due to the rainfall, but why would the monsoon rains produce any change in the contraction rate? You could imagine that there would be vertical loading on producing some seasonal uplift pattern, but you do see a contraction rate. And actually, the reason we do see a seasonal contraction is that a lot of the rainfall actually is stored in aquifers at front of the Himalaya. So on this you can measure with GRACE, with gravimetric measurements, and you can see that you have a peak-to-peak amplitude in the water being stored in the Gangetic plain, corresponding to about 70 centimeters of water thickness equivalent. And next thing you can do is try to imagine what will be the effect on contraction across the Himalaya. So when the monsoon arrives, you're loading the front of the Himalaya, so there's a trampoline effect. And because the Himalaya is on the edge of the trampoline, it's going to be put in extension. So that will slow down the contraction rate in the Himalaya. So that's what's happening in the summer. In the winter, the aquifers will move down, the water will be drained to the sea, and then the contraction will be faster. We'll have a rebound. The contraction will be faster in the winter. And so we have modeled that, and you can see that you get a very good fit to both the horizontal displacement and the vertical displacement recorded at here a subset of stations. So, by the way, that's why I think that that doesn't leave too much room for slow slip events in the Himalaya. Okay, so now we have an explanation for the seasonal variation. The seasonal variation in seismicity is just matching, so this is the seismicity rate for different magnitudes, comparing with the stress rate measured from this, determined from this model. So faster convergence rate, faster stress rate, and faster seismicity rate in the winter, and in the summer it's just the opposite. So everything is falling together relatively nicely. So now there's something intriguing. You can see that the variation peak to peak of the seasonal Coulomb stress is of the order of 1,000, 2,000 Pascal. This is the same order of magnitude as solid earth tides. We know that there is no response to earth tides in the Himalaya. We've done some tests. There's a clear response at 1 year, but very little response, actually no detectable response at any component of the tides. So now, how do you explain that the seismicity would vary, would respond to this variation at 1 year, but not at variation of same amplitude at 12 hours? The explanation is that it has to do probably with the time it takes for earthquake to nucleate. It tells you that earthquake cannot nucleate instantaneously. Otherwise, you would have a huge variation of seismicity, because here the stressing rate would be fast. Would be actually 700 faster than the stress rate due to the seasonal variation, because it's the same amplitude, but you go from 1 year to half a day in period. So we don't see that in the seismicity. So that's a clear indication that the nucleation time of earthquake is much larger than 12 hours. And actually, it could be larger than 1 year, in fact. But it could be of the order of 1 year, but certainly much larger than 12 hours. Okay, time to conclude. I think I went already a bit over time. So I hope first that now this intriguing observation that I listed at the beginning of the talk are making sense to you, and that we've come up with reasonable explanations for them. The first conclusion is that the Gorkha earthquake unzipped a fraction of the fault that was locked before in the interseismic period, and actually it brought down the Himalaya. So the uplift of the Himalaya is actually resulting mostly from a seismic deformation in the interseismic period. So it's related to ductile shear at the root of the MHT system, so past the brittle ductile transition. The condition that earthquakes release elastic strain at a rate balancing elastic interseismic loading requires millenary magnitude 9 earthquakes. So that's I hope there would be a flow in the reasoning I presented today, but at the moment I would say that's the most conservative hypothesis we can make when it comes to doing probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. It's not good news, but I don't see at the moment how we can propose a better, a more reasonable scenario. So some aspect of future earthquake can be assessed and taken into account in seismic hazard studies. So we discuss how we can, infer or how we understand the pattern of high frequency wave generated by the Gorkha earthquake. Because actually what you care about is not the moment being released by earthquake, is really where will the high frequency come from. The high frequency waves will be creating damages, and the two things can be a bit different, as we've seen for the Gorkha earthquake. And on the last point, I think we have come up with a good reasonable explanation for the seasonal variation of strain and seismicity in the Himalaya. Why is that I'm excited about that is that probably at the moment that's the best approach we can take to sort of probe the state of stress of the system, because what can tell us whether the system getting ripe to produce a very large earthquake? It will be the state of stress of the fault, whether the stress are getting close to critical over a large area. And we don't know how to measure stress at the moment, but what we can do is see how the system is responding to small stress variations due to tides or seasonal loading. So my hope is that by focusing at the response to tides and seasonal variation, we might be able to probe the stress of the system and maybe be able to say to move from doing probably seismic hazard that is time independent to being time dependent, to sort of take into account how ripe is the system for a really large damaging earthquake. I think it's time to close the talk, and I will be very happy to take your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Jean-Philippe. There is some delay between MS Team and Yahoo and YouTube. So in the meantime, by the time I get questions from YouTube, I will request if there's any question from the people who are present on MS Team.
Vinit, I have one or two queries. Jean-Philippe, I was really very much impressed with connecting the time scale of the contemporary age to going back to 100 years and then geological past through your talk. Thank you very much. The question which I really would like to learn, because there is a long debate on the magnitude of the earthquake 9. So that's one thing. Another thing I was also wondering that if you see in one of your slides from your recent paper, 2021, there appeared to be a gap at the Kashmir. Red color is disappearing. And also when we see the slip partitioning in Kashmir, there is a kind of splitting as what we see when in the very slightly in the Nepal earthquake, also in a small portion in the northern side. So, are they artifacts of the model, or this partitioning of the slip? Are they really? We are thinking that that could be the generating small earthquakes, those partition slips. And also, when we are talking of the large magnitude earthquakes, do we also think that there is a possibility of aseismic, or I mean slow slip kind of the release of strain over the long period of time?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the rich question. So let's maybe yeah, but I can use this map here. So here we have the geodetic strain, and you were pointing to the fact that we do see lateral variations, right? And I would say that there are indeed lateral variations that are difficult to at the moment assess really well because of the uncertainty of the GPS measurement and the distribution of the GPS measurement. So in that regard, there's a paper by Luca D'Arzilio that I didn't include in the talk, and I was not involved in the study, where they did a Bayesian inversion of the GPS data to explore more broadly all the possible models that would go for models that will assume very little locking to models that would assume full locking. So it's a little broader than what we had done with Vicky Stevens, so that there is less weight from the regularization. We have a regularization in the inversion that we've done that sort of favor relatively smooth. So if I go back to one of these maps, that favors a relatively smooth pattern of locking, and we see that. Let me show one of the map. Yeah. Yeah, let's take this one. So here you can see that there's a lateral continuity that is an effect of the regularization of the inversion, because where we have little constraint, where we have sparse data, we impose that the solution is smooth. And there's also a trick in the inversion where we have seismicity. We said that we have stress concentration so that we have a high gradient in the locking pattern. So that tends to produce this model. It's not the only solution, and it's certainly a solution that tends to favor relatively high locking, and that might exaggerate a little bit the moment deficit. So, but if you look at the solution from the Bayesian inversion that Luca D'Arzilio has done, actually, you get something that's maybe a factor of 2 less, the most probable, but that's very far from what we would need to go, let's say, below 8.5 to balance the moment budget. So the analysis in terms of how this new interseismic model is going to impact the estimate of the maximum event is on the way. It's not done yet, but it's not going to change a lot. It's not going to go down to magnitude 8. It will be above magnitude 8.5 for sure. What I would hope is that with more GPS measurements, we will start to see details here with segmentation. Because if we see segmentation, that would be extremely precious to help inform seismic hazard assessment. Because at the moment we say we need to have a magnitude 9 every 1,000 years, but we are unable to say where it might happen, where there would be some segmentation or not. So I think we could probably refine that with more better coverage. I'm not sure I covered everything you were asking.
But here, if you see the width of the, you can say down dip limit of the lock zone, it appears to be so deep, going up to beyond 25, 30 kilometers. So do you think at that depth, temperature range, we still have the lock zone or aseismic slip we should have?
Yeah, so in that area, I agree that that seems a little deep. I don't know. It may be that because of the slip partitioning effect that you were referring to, we are not doing a very good job here. I agree with that. Probably the way we treat deformation in southern Tibet, the Karakoram fault, could be improved, and it might change this a little bit. I agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We need
Professor Harsh Gupta wanted to ask something.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I can hear you, Harsh. Nice to hear you.
Yeah, first of all, my compliments for a wonderful talk, a very comprehensive talk, Gene. I really enjoyed it. I have some concerns. You see, the question that Viren also raised is about leaking of the energy through slow earthquakes. So on our all budget calculation, that is not taken into account. And second thing is this, that globally, did we ever have a magnitude 9 earthquake in a continental region? I see no such evidence. Then there was also a question of damage to buildings in Kathmandu, which was much lower than what was anticipated from some earthquake. There was some explanation that there was very little soil liquefaction in the Gorkha earthquake. And the reason for not having that soil liquefaction was lowering of the water table due to excessive pumping. So I think these are certain questions which we need to really address, especially about the slow earthquakes, because all of our strain budgets are devoid of information about slow earthquakes.
Okay, thank you, Ash. Very good question. So about the fact that magnitude 9 for a continental earthquake, of course, is a provocative statement. I have to admit it. But we have to remember that at the moment, the largest continental earthquake ever recorded is the Assam earthquake of 1950, which was 8.7.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And so it happened right there. And then the question is there something special in Assam so that magnitude 8.7 might happen only there? Or should we be prepared for similar earthquake happening elsewhere in the Himalaya? And what I'm saying is that probably the most conservative hypothesis is to say that similar earthquake might also happen elsewhere. I would hope to see slow slip events releasing a lot of energy, and maybe this could happen because we know that some slow slip event can have a wide range of return periods. So we haven't seen any significant one over the period covered with geodetic measurements in Nepal or in India where data are available. But I would not exclude that we would have some in the future. That calls for monitoring. I would be surprised, however, that it would change the budget a lot. I'm not sure the slow slip event can do the job. Having a different coupling pattern, I think that the work that Luca did recently and the new analysis that is doing with Sylvain Michel will help address that. But basically, we would like to refine in any case this pattern with more measurement, because I admit that here regularization plays a big role in this continuity that we see in this map, and that's one factor pushing for larger earthquake needed to release the moment deficit. Yeah. But it would be hard to go below 8.5. I think that would be very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, 8.5. There's a lot of difference between 8.5 and magnitude 9.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So, also as far as the hazard is concerned, we have seen what smaller earthquakes have done. A 7.8, the Muzaffarabad earthquake of 2005, claimed 82,000 human lives. And that earthquake occurred in about 9 a.m. or so local time, when everyone is out. And our estimates of a repeat of a magnitude 8 earthquake anywhere in the frontal Himalayan region, if it occurs in the middle of the night, it could claim up to 1 million human lives.
Wow, that's scary. Yeah.
But that is what the reality is.
Yeah.
Because even earthquakes of smaller magnitude, like I just mentioned, the Muzaffarabad earthquake, which was only 7.6 or 7.7.
Yeah, it's right.
2000. And that occurred also when everyone is out. And most of the problem is because of the houses. The houses kill the people here. So it's a scary picture. But anyway, we have to prepare for that. Thanks once again for your wonderful talk.
Well, thank you very much, Ash, for your comments.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I'll go to the chat box and start reading the questions. Singhvi Saab or Arun Singh Saab?
Or maybe there's something I wanted to say that that relates to the question that Ash asked about the high frequency. So the reason that I favor for the mild shaking in Kathmandu is the fact that the high frequencies were coming from far north, right? So there was more distance for wave to attenuate by the time they hit the basin. There's an additional effect that the sediments themselves have an inelastic response, so they absorb some energy. So that also has played a role. And then there's the water effect that could have also played a role that Ash. So it might not be a single answer. Yeah.
Multi reasons for that to see. Yeah, I agree. Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, so I think I'll go to Jean. I mean, just stop me when you're tired, because I know it's very awkward time for you to to continue this talk, because
I'm very happy to have this conversation. I don't have very often the opportunity to be in India, even virtually.
Thank you. So I'll start picking questions from chat box now. If you want, you can also see them, but I will read it for you. So there's one question from Dr. Anand Pandey, who is one of our colleagues here in NGRI. Does the coseismic slip observed at the rupture front in the HFT zone through paleoseismical studies accounts for complete strain budget during the interseismic period? What proportion, if not? So the point he's trying to make here is that through paleoseismical investigation, we have found that how much slip has occurred. That's what you showed. In fact, the budget between 21 the Holocene period slip rate 21 millimeter per year, and from Geodetic almost like 18. So he's again asking the same question, that do they actually balance out?
Yes. So one big assumption that we're making is that the geodetic strain is stationary, that it doesn't change with time, by the way, because we're comparing a slip rate over 10,000 years with a geodetic rate measured over a decade or so, right? So we have to keep in mind that in this moment budget analysis, we are making a big jump. The justification for making that jump is that when you look at different sections across the Himalaya, you don't see huge variation in the convergence rate. Let's say that if the convergence rate was changing a lot over the seismic cycle, let's say it would be very fast after an earthquake, and then it would diminish with time, then I would expect that you would see lateral variation, because all the segments are not in the same stage of the cycle. So the fact that it varies between, I would say, 14 on the 18 millimeter per year is a suggestion that there are not huge variations, but there could be some that we haven't taken into account. Now, you would expect the geodetic rate to be faster than the geological rate, right? You can't have the fault at the front moving faster than by how much you're contracting the range. So we tend to see in general that it's close, or even there are places where it's the opposite, which is not physical. So I don't have a good explanation for the places where it looks like the fault is moving faster. The only explanation might be that the balance of energy might happen over a very long period of time. That may be many tens of thousands of years. So you could have the fault slipping for a period of time that is a little faster, maybe than the geodetic strain. And these are variations that we are ignoring completely at the moment because we don't know how to put that in a model. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. There's a question by Himanshu Paul, where he's asking when the Himalayan front is logged, so when the frontal part of the Himalayan region is logged, then what is the mechanism by which transient earthquakes, probably he means transient slip or the slow slip occur? What is the mechanism which drives it?
Okay, so you have the fault being locked, right? And you need to have transient slip events to unlock that thing. The simplest model is that you have an earthquake starting at the edge, at the down deep edge, because it's loaded. That's where you have actually loading by the interseismic period. You have the earthquake nucleating here and then propagating due to the dynamic waves all the way to the surface, as happened in those dynamic models I was showing from the work of Luca Dalzilio. By the way, in these models, we don't have any slow slip event. But you could imagine that on the fault, there would be patches where we would have a rheology that would be, let's say, rate strengthening, that would favor creep, right? Those areas that favor creep, they would be locked in the interseismic period because they would be pinned by the down deep part of the locked fault zone. But they should slip in after earthquake. So you would expect to see after slip. So it would be a transient slow slip triggered by a previous rupture because you need to bring stress to trigger them. We were hoping to see that after the Gorkha earthquake. And we did see some after slip, but it was mostly deeper than the rupture. There was no slow slip on the shallow portion of the fault that was locked. That doesn't tell that it might not happen at other places. And if that was to happen, that could release some significant moment. Keep in mind that for the Parkfield earthquake, which is sort of an extreme case, but slow slip after the earthquake released twice as much moment as the earthquake itself, right? So there was twice as much moment released by slow slip than by the earthquake itself. We would love this to happen in the Himalaya. It didn't happen following the Gorkha earthquake, but there might be places where something like that would happen, and that would be good news. But yeah, so far, nothing like that has been seen. But you need GPS. You need permanent GPS to see that. There's no other way.
Thanks, Ian. There are two questions by Jayan Perumal, if you remember. He's a guy. He's the guy who has done a lot of work on paleoseismology. So he says he's asking that between at the border of India and Nepal, Western Nepal, between longitude 80 to 82, seismicity pattern shows dual. There are two belt of seismicity. So what does it mean? I mean, does it show dual locking line, or does it reflect any intermediate detachment ramp or something?
Yeah. Thank you, Jayan, for the interesting question. So you're talking about that area, right, where we do see a duplication in the belt of seismicity. So I don't have a complete. I don't have an explanation that I completely like at the moment. But what is sure is that here, when you look at the structure of the range, you have a relatively complex duplex system, and it is probable that you have a ramp jumping to another ramp, a lateral variation in the structure. So it could be that actually you have different ramps creeping, producing different zones of stress accumulation at different locations. So that would cause this different this distinction between these two belts. There's a paper, I have forgotten the name of the first author, but who has argued for that, and I think it's a reasonable explanation. We can't really demonstrate that the case with the GPS measurements because there's not enough spatial resolution to really see that. But because if that were true, we should be able to see that in the geodetic data. But at the moment, it's not at the level. We don't have the density and the precision in the data to see it.
He's posing another question, which is related to the influence of Shillong Plateau on the Himalayan adjoining Himalayan region. So he's asking, the locking heterogeneity is very weak east of Nepal, which is Arunachal area and the Sikkim area, Bhutan also. Is it due to frontal buttress, as we have Shillong Plateau in the foreland, is not being considered for estimating the locking heterogeneity? So he's essentially asking, what are the influence of Shillong Plateau on the locking on the MF on the main Himalayan thrust in that part of Himalaya? Yeah.
So we've been careful not to include the Shillong Plateau. It's a complicated object, and so. In the analysis we are doing, we do take into account, however, the complexity brought by the Shillong Plateau. So we first do a sort of block model. Actually, it's based on the work that some of you may have been involved in. There's this paper by Vernon et al. We did an analysis of that. So we follow what they've done. So we have a block here that has a different kinematics that allow for some shortening in the Shillong Plateau. So there's a bit of convergence between India and Tibet that is absorbed in the Shillong Plateau, and that doesn't go to the Himalaya. It's taken into account in our model. So it reduces a little bit the convergence rate, but not a lot.
Thanks.
Oh, by the way, there are variations in the seismicity, in the intensity of the seismicity that I haven't really explained, right? And yeah, they could be related. Here we don't see much, right? So yeah.
There's one question which is very straightforward. What is the role of transverse ridges cross-cutting the Himalayan structure grid in terms of stress accumulation, in terms of coupling, in terms of segmentation, and all those things?
Okay, so now this is another excellent question. So I think we see the effect of the transverse ridges on the structure of the range. When you look at the clips and on the long-term evolution of the range and on the duplex system in the Himalaya, it looks like where you have the ridge coming up, you have an interruption of the higher crystalline Himalaya clip. So you've had more, maybe more accumulation of lesser Himalayas or something like that. There's a paper by Laurent Bollinger and other groups have looked at this kind of thing. So certainly the ridges have an effect on the structure of the range. When we look at the geodetic data, it is not so clear to me. Luca is arguing that there are places where he would see less coupling where the ridges are coming in. It is possible, but it's also places where there are not so much geodetic data, so I'm not too sure. When you go to oceanic megathrust, there are places where there's a clear relationship. So it would not be surprising to have one, but I don't see one popping up, obviously in the data at the moment. I don't know what you think, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the resolution of genetic data is not, I mean, we don't have enough data to still prove that they really have, they really influence the coupling but of course you're right, we have seen it in oceanic subduction zone that they clearly do influence. Yeah. Okay, there's another question by Pawan. is there any mathematical physical model that predicted the earthquake exactly or nearly? Can we build an earthquake model by using fault mechanics? Oh, your work on uh, with Lapusta, that kind of work. So it talks about physical model that predicted earthquakes exactly or nearly. Can we build an earthquake model by using fault mechanics, maths, physics, physical phenomena occurring at earthquakes?
Yes, so it is really my hope. So that thank you. That's a very good question. So I really hope that down the road we will be able to actually use these physical models to inform seismic hazard. It's going to be very hard to actually do a dynamic model that would be tuned to fit the data and use the model to do seismic hazard directly. That's, I don't think it's going to happen any soon. However, you might use learning from those dynamic models to actually move from time-independent seismic hazard to time-dependent. And so let me explain what I mean here. At the moment, we say the probability of having a PGA exceeding, let's say, 80% of G over this period of time, over these 30 years, is, I don't know, 5%. Okay? But we are not telling anybody if we're talking about the 30 years starting from now, or 30 years in 100 years from now, it's 30 years taken at random in the seismic cycle. And I mean, the engineers, they would like to know what is the probability for the 10 coming years, for the 5 years. So they would like a time-dependent seismic hazard assessment. And at the moment, we are not able to do it, which is very painful. There was a hope that with the seismic gap hypothesis, we might be able to do that, but it's not working. So that's where I believe that using dynamic model might help. Because when you do run these dynamic models, you see that there's a pattern. You see that you need to build up energy in the system, and then you release the energy. So if you look at the seismic hazard in such a dynamic model, it is not time independent. You do have variations. And then you can use the models to try to see how you might use observations to say something about where you are in the seismic cycle. So it could be, for example, that you look at Gorkha. Gorkha is an area where there was quite intense seismicity before the earthquake at the down deep edge. So you could argue that's a sign that the system was more critical, right? That the system was closer to rupture. And where you look at it, let's say here, there are fewer events. You could say, well, maybe that's an indication that it's less right. I'm not sure that works, but there's a hope that by using the dynamic model, we might be able to see that. One difficulty we're facing is that to do this kind of inference, we need the dynamic models to be able to reproduce both the very small earthquakes and the very large earthquakes, because it's a problem of how the small earthquakes are going to reflect the state of stress. It's very challenging in those models to produce both small and large earthquakes, because there you need to get small earthquakes, you're going to model a small area with small cells, small disruption, and so on. And then you will be looking at a patch that is, I don't know, kilometers. When you want to do the whole Himalaya, if you use the same parameters, the simulation are just not doable. They would take years to run. So there's a real numerical problems to use dynamic simulation in that direction. But that's a challenge. I'm sure that people working on this numerical technique will be able to solve at some point. So people like Nadia Lapusta, my dear colleague from Caltech. Oh, I don't hear you, Vinit.
There's a question by Himanshu Paul. He's asking, what do you actually mean by nucleation time of earthquake? Does it mean does this mean the time between stress development to rupture nucleation?
Yes, so that's that's a concept that is a bit complicated. So, but let me explain how it works. So let's take the n member of assuming that the sort of simplest standard Coulomb failure model, that an earthquake is happening when the ratio of the shear stress to the normal stress, it's a static value of friction. Okay, so you could imagine that the stress drop is instantaneous when you hit that value, that the drop of friction, that you go from static friction to dynamic friction instantaneously, and immediately you will have the earthquake nucleating. There would be no nucleation time. So now this is possible with a spring on slider system. You could have a behavior like that. Now what's going to happen if you have a fault with a certain patch, first, what you observe in the lab is that the friction, the drop of friction from static to dynamic is not instantaneous. It's sort of linear with slip. Okay, so and that's governed by the frictional properties of the fault. As slip is occurring, you have elastic unloading of the system, and so the driving force is going to decrease as well as the resisting force. Right. So on the drop of the driving force actually depends on the stiffness of the system. If you have slip, let's not consider a spring on slider system, but let's consider that we have a crack, a circular crack slipping. If the crack is very small and you have a bit of slip, the stress is going to drop immediately, because the stress drop is proportional to slip divided by the area. So the square root of the area. So if the area is small, slip divided by the square root of the area will be very large. So it's the shear modulus multiplied by slip divided by the square root of the area. So this quantity will be very large. So you will have a very rapid drop of the driving stress. So you can't have immediate rupture on a small crack. It's not possible. You need the crack to be large enough so that the driving stress doesn't drop too fast, so that it exceeds the resisting stress, and you can impart some acceleration to the system and have a rupture. So you need a critical size of the fault. If the fault is too small, it can only grow quasi-statically. And then at some point it might be able to run away. So it takes time to go from this stage where it can run away. So there's a nucleation time associated to that. Okay, and so the nucleation time could be very small, could be very long. Actually, we have very little clue on the duration. The fact that we don't see a response to tide, it's an indication that the nucleation time is relatively long. It's not years, because there would be little response to seasonal variation, and we do see a response. It cannot be many years.
Jean-Philippe, I understand that it's almost like midnight, but there are only 3-4 questions. If you like, we can.
Let's answer them. I've taken the pain to write. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry that we are making you wake up till midnight.
No, don't worry. It's my pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. So there is one question by Dr. Kalachan Sen. He's the director he's heading Wadi Institute of Himalayan Geology at Dehradun. Is there any scope for slow earthquake in central Himalayan seismic gap? Central Himalayan seismic gap, where we have Nepal and Gorkha region. So is there any scope for a slow slip earthquake in that region? I mean, you have answered this question.
Yeah, I think the only possibility would be to have a lot of afterslip after an earthquake, because we haven't seen any spontaneous slow slip over the 20 years of geodetic data that we have, right? So, or they would be very rare. They would occur, once every few decades, but we haven't seen any yet of that sort. So I don't think there is high hope, but I would be happily surprised to see somewhere in the Himalayas suddenly a slow slip event of large magnitude. That would be great. Keep in mind that slow slip event can release magnitude, can be equivalent to magnitude 7.5, or yeah, the largest slow slip event can go as high as 7.5, so it can be significant. But most of the time they have a return period that don't exceed decades. I mean, the one that have been documented so far. Yeah.
There's a question on landslide, which related to Gorkha earthquake. Recent studies document landslides triggered by the Gorkha earthquake. Can you comment on its relation with observed seasonal variation of seismicity?
Well, yeah. Okay, so the Gorkha earthquake triggered a lot of landslides, and actually that also contributed to destroying the topography of the Himalaya. So not only the Himalaya went down, the high Himalaya, but also there was a pulse of erosion due to all the landslides after the Gorkha earthquake. So when you ask about the relationship between seismicity on landslides, it looks like it's only the large earthquakes that correlate with landslides. I don't think there is any significant impact on this background seismicity, the magnitude up to 5.8 that I've been talking about. Those earthquakes are too small to have a significant impact on the landslide, because every year there are landslides triggered by the monsoon anyway, and so the additional impact of the earthquake is relatively small, and also they occur mostly in the winter. Well, dominantly in the winter. Yeah.
He has added one more question, which I'll although I'm not very clear, but essentially what he's asking is that Kashmir earthquake, was it a decollement earthquake or was it out of sequence earthquake? And I mean, that's his main concern, I guess.
Yeah. So yes, I think it would be correct to describe the Kashmir earthquake as an out of sequence earthquake. The structure gets more complicated when you get close to the western syntax, and so it's not the decollement earthquake for sure, because the dip angle on that fault was, if I remember, 25, or I mean, yeah, something maybe 25 degrees or something like that. It was not 7 degrees like for Gorkha earthquake. So it's more like a ramp than on a splay fault. So out of seconds earthquake rather than something really related to the MHT. Yeah.
One of my colleague, Dr. Monica, she is asking, although you have partly answered this question, what is the role of structural segmentation of MHT and how it is affecting in releasing the strain energy? I mean, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah. So the MFT, I think, has the structure, the lateral complexity on the MFT, I think, has very little impact on the large earthquakes, because when there's a large earthquakes, they propagate to the surface, and then they get complicated when they reach the terrain. They split into smaller. What was seen during the earthquake in Sichuan, right, from 2010, and so it gets segmented, but that's a very relatively shallow effect, and I don't think this segmentation near the surface has as much impact actually on the seismic cycle itself. Yeah. It has impact on the growth of the geological structure, but not on the seismic cycle, in my opinion.
There is one question.
Maybe what I'd like to say, I don't think that when you can isolate segment of the MFT. So, for example, I don't think these segments would rupture as individual events. For example, I would say that they would probably come together with larger ruptures that would root at depth with other segments. Yeah.
Is seasonal seismicity variation exist? Does it exist all over the Himalaya now? Do you expect it to see all over the Himalaya? That's the seasonal variation.
So That's, I'm not sure, because it could be that the sensitivity to seasonal variation vary with time. The reason I'm saying is that if you imagine that you have a seismic cycle, stress building up, stress readings by major 8.5 or so earthquake and building up again. The sensitivity to seasonal is maximum where the stress is high. And when the stress is lower, then you would have a lower sensitivity to seasonal. So it could be that that might be a way to detect lateral variation in the stress level of the system, in the level of criticality of the system. What I'm saying is a bit vague, but I believe that's an area where we might learn something interesting. And so maybe the fact that we had a strong seasonality in Nepal before Gorkha might be related to the fact that actually the system was ripe for Gorkha.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one question by my colleague, Dr. Shri Nagesh. So he says that, look, we can have scenarios of a large earthquake occurrence, but what is it which governs the nucleation of these large earthquakes? The place of nucleation, what is it which governs the place of nucleation for these large earthquakes?
So I think that the smaller and the large earthquake, they nucleate at exactly the same place. And it's just that, so I would say predicting the nucleation of earthquake is useless. You have earthquakes every day, right? So what you want to predict is the probability that an earthquake will grow bigger, a probability that the stress field is going to be appropriate for the earthquake to grow bigger. And that's where the dynamic models can help evaluate that. It's a difficult problem. We've been working on that for quite a while, and we haven't found a clue yet. So so that's really the thing, is that predicting the nucleation of an earthquake is useless. What you want is to assess the probability that if an earthquake happened there, it can exceed a certain magnitude. And on the day we can do that, that will be a huge advance, but we are not there yet.
Thank you. There are two last questions. One is, are climatic erosional effects important to consider in estimating the long-term geological strain?
So the erosion, I didn't mention that. It plays a role when you do these long-term models of deformation. This is something that Rodolphe Catin was my first postdoc, actually. He never worked on the Himalaya, obviously, was doing. And you need the erosion to unload the system. Otherwise, you can't have a sort of steady-state regime of the seismic cycle if you don't include the erosion, right? So because the topography you need to have the topography to be at some sort of steady state to have a seismic cycle that would resemble reality. So it's important to take erosion into account. The effect of erosion on seismicity is relatively small compared, because you are removing rocks, so you're changing the normal stress, so you are increasing the Coulomb stress. So it does favor seismicity, but it's small compared to the stress buildup at the tip of the creeping zone. I don't remember the ratio. There's a paper by Steer et al. Philip Steer, S-T-E-E-R. Catin was the advisor on this project, and they looked at that. And so I think the ratio is of the order of maybe 10% or less than that. Yeah. No, but that's a good question.
Can I ask one question? I mean, I have plenty of them, but just one.
Of course.
We are running a network in Garhwal Kumaon region, and the sampling interval. So the high frequency. You mentioned about high frequency GPS sampling rate. So we are. Is there any optimum rate of high frequency? I mean, we are doing it at one sample per second. But you mentioned 5 sample per second. So is there any optimal number on this? Because everything is ultimately the size of the memory which you have and how many times you visit it. Yeah.
Actually, my favorite system would be to have 1 Hertz is good. I think it's relatively good. Of course, 5 Hertz is better, but what is even better is to put MEMS accelerometer with the seismic station, so that you get the high frequencies from another sensor that will store only the high frequencies. And I think that would be the best setup, so that you're not storing unnecessary large volume of data. So the system we had in Nepal is a buffer. So it's a ring buffer. So you have 2 weeks to go to the station to get to the high rate station the day there's an earthquake. And for the Gorkha earthquake, it's been a real challenge because some of the stations were really remote. So that's 1 Hertz is a little safer because you have a longer ring buffer. And if you have MEMS, then you have a complete broadband stations going all the way from high frequencies to static. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I mean, even at midnight, you have answered all very
well, but
enthusiastically. I'm so happy. So
I will easily, no problem.
Ram Mohan?
Yes. On behalf of DJYC, I thank Professor Jean-Philippe Auoec for accepting our request to deliver the 5th Diamond Jubilee lecture on most relevant topic for all of us. Professor Jean-Philippe has enlightened us by integrating the mountain building activity to seismicity, documenting the variations in geodetic convergence and geological sharpening, those responsible for the major earthquakes, and dynamic models for Gorkha earthquake, seasonal variations of strain and seismicity with focus on periodicities on Himalayan seismicity. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that today's lecture is full of knowledge with many new thoughts for us to work upon. I thank Professor Singhvi, Harsh Gupta, Dimri, R.N. Singh, and Kalachan Sain for attending today's lecture. All scientists and research scholars are thanked for attending the 5th Diamond Jubilee lecture through virtual media across the globe. Thanks one and all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It was a wonderful lecture, Jeeval. Wonderful. We enjoyed it a lot. I had many questions, but I thought younger people should ask you. So maybe sometimes when we catch up, we'll ask. Or I'll ask Vineet to answer my questions, Vineet and Tiwari to ask.
Yeah, Ashok, I'd be happy to reconnect with you on Zoom whenever you want. In the virtual world, if it's not at the middle of the night.
It could be your midday and my midnight, no problems. Not a problem. Okay. Have a nice evening. And thank you so much
for joining the call today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I see that you're talking, Vineet, but I don't hear you.
Yeah, probably. We can go offline. We can disconnect YouTube now so that we can talk on MS Team.
Yeah, sure, sir. Sure.
So are we offline now?
I still hear you.
No.